This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Time for part 2 of The United States is Still a British Colony by James Montgomery. The Forgotten Amendment. The Articles of Confederation, Article 6 states, quote, "Nor shall the United States in Congress assembled," and United is not capitalized, by the way, "or any of them grant any title of nobility," unquote. The Constitution for the United States, United not capitalized, in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 states, quote, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States," United not capitalized, "and no person holding any office or profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept any of the present emolument, office, or title, or of any kind whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state," unquote. Also, Section 10, Clause 1 states, quote, "No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque or reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto of law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility," unquote. There was, however, no measurable penalty for violation of the above sections. Congress saw this as a great threat to the freedom of Americans and our Republican form of government. In January 1810, Senator Reed proposed the original 13th Amendment. And it has nothing to do with the 13th Amendment you know of today. The original 13th Amendment, and on April 26, 1810, was passed by the Senate 26-1, and by the House 87-3 on May 1st, 1810, and submitted to the 17 states for ratification. The amendment read as follows, quote, "If any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive, or retain any title of nobility or honor, or shall, without the consent of Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, office, or emolument of any kind whatever from any emperor, king, prince, or foreign power, such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them or either of them," unquote. From An American Dictionary of the English Language, first edition, by Noah Webster, 1828, the definition of nobility is, the third definition, the quality, quote, "the qualities which constitute distinction of rank in civil society, according to the customs or laws of the country, that eminence or dignity which a man derives from birth or title conferred, and which places him in an order above common men." And the fourth definition, "the persons collectively who enjoy rank above commoners, i.e. the peerage," unquote. The aforementioned sections in the Constitution for the United States and the above proposed 13th Amendment sought to prohibit the above definition, which would give any advantage or privilege to some citizens an unequal opportunity to achieve or exercise political power. 13 of the 17 states listed below understood the importance of this amendment. The following states voted for the amendment between the years 1810 and 1819. How is that possible? Well, anyway, Maryland, Kentucky, Ohio, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Vermont, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Virginia all voted in favor of the original 13th Amendment, with 4 states against: New York, Connecticut, South Carolina, Rhode Island. Okay. On March 10th, 1819, the Virginia legislature passed Act Number 280, Virginia Archives of Richmond Miscellaneous File, page 299, for microfilm. This guy did his homework. He's looking at microfilm in the legal law archives of the states. Okay, the following quote: "Be it enacted by the General Assembly that there shall be published an edition of the laws of this Commonwealth, in which shall be contained the following matters, that is to say, the Constitution of the United States and the amendments thereto," unquote. And United is not capitalized. The official day of ratification was March 12, 1819. This was the date of republication of the Virginia Civil Code. Virginia ordered 4,000 copies, almost triple their usual order. Word of Virginia's 1819 ratification spread throughout the states, and both Rhode Island and Kentucky published the new amendment in 1822. Ohio published the new amendment in 1824. Maine ordered 10,000 copies of the Constitution with the new amendment to be printed for use in the public schools, and again in 1831 for their census edition. Indiana published the new amendment in the Indiana Revised Laws of 1831 on page 20. The Northwest Territories published the new amendment in 1833. Ohio published the new amendment again in 1831 and in 1833. Connecticut, one of the states that voted against the new amendment, published the new amendment in 1835. Wisconsin Territory published the new amendment in 1839. Iowa Territory published the new amendment in 1843. Ohio published the new amendment again in 1848. Kansas published the new amendment in 1855. And Nebraska Territory published the new amendment 6 years in a row from 1855 to 1860. Colorado Territory published the new amendment in 1865 and again 1867. In the 1867 printing, the present 13th Amendment, the Slavery Amendment, was listed as the 14th Amendment. The repeated reprinting of the amended United States Constitution is conclusive evidence of its passage. Also, as evidence of the new 13th Amendment's impending passage, on December 2nd, 1817, John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, wrote to Buck, an attorney, regarding the position Buck had been assigned. The letter reads, quote, "If it should be the opinion of this government that the acceptance on your part of the commission under which it was granted did not interfere with your citizenship, it is the opinion of the executive that under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, by the acceptance of such an appointment from any foreign government, a citizen of the United States ceases to enjoy that character, and becomes incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under the United States or either of them. Unquote from John Quincy Adams. By virtue of these titles and honors and special privileges, lawyers have assumed political and economic advantages over the majority of citizens. You ever wonder, folks, why all of Congress are lawyers? This is why. And they've flushed the original 13th Amendment down the memory hole. That was the amendment that would have stripped them of their citizenship and got them thrown out of this country. They have the nobility, the title of nobility, as an esquire, which shows their allegiance to the King of England. Back to the essay. A majority may vote, but only a minority, lawyers, may run for political office today. After the War of 1812 was concluded, the Treaty of Ghent was signed and ratified. See footnote 6. In Article 4 of the treaty, the United States gained what was already given in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, namely, islands off the U.S. coast. Also, 2 men were to be given the power to decide the borders and disagreements. If they could not, the power was to be given to an outside sovereign power, and their decision was final and considered conclusive. In Article 9, it is admitted there are citizens and subjects in America. As you have seen, the 2 terms are interchangeable, synonymous. In Article 10, you will see where the idea for the overthrow of this country came from and on what issue. The issue raised by England was slavery, and it was nurtured by the king's emissaries behind the scenes. This would finally lead to the Civil War, even though the Supreme Court had declared the states and their citizens' property rights could not be infringed on by the United States government or Congress. This was further declared by the following presidential quotes, where they declared to violate the states' rights would violate the U.S. Constitution. Also, history shows that slavery would not have existed much longer in the southern states. Public sentiment was changing, and slavery was quickly disappearing. The Civil War was about destroying property rights and the U.S. Constitution, which supported these rights. Read the following quotes of presidents just before the Civil War. Quote, I believe that involuntary servitude, as it exists in different states of this Confederacy, is recognized by the Constitution. I believe that it stands like any other admitted right, and that the states where it exists are entitled to efficient remedies to enforce the constitutional provisions. That's from Franklin Pierce's inaugural address, 1853, unquote. Quote, the whole territorial question being thus settled upon the principle of popular sovereignty, a principle as ancient as free government itself, everything of a practical nature has been decided. No other question remains for adjustment, because all agree that under the Constitution, slavery in the states is beyond the reach of any human power except that of the respective states themselves wherein it exists. Unquote, that from James Buchanan's inaugural address, 1857. Quote, I cordially congratulate you upon the final settlement by the Supreme Court of the United States of the question of slavery in the territories, which had presented an aspect so truly formidable at the commencement of my administration. The right has been established of every citizen to take his property of any kind, including slaves, into the common territories belonging equally to all the states of the Confederacy, and to have it protected there under the federal Constitution. Neither Congress nor a territorial legislature, nor any human power, has any authority to annul or impair this vested right. The Supreme Judicial Tribunal of the country, which is a coordinate branch of the government, has sanctioned and affirmed these principles of constitutional law, so manifestly just in themselves and so well calculated to promote peace and harmony among the states, unquote, that from James Buchanan's third annual message, 1859. So there is no misunderstanding. I am not re-arguing slavery. Slavery is morally wrong and contrary to God's almighty law. In this divisive issue, the true attack was on our natural rights and on the Constitution. The core of the attack was on our right to possess allodial property. Our God-given right to own property in allodial was taken away by conquest of the Civil War. If you are free, this right cannot be taken away. The opposite of free is slave or subject. We were allowed to believe we were free for about 70 years. Then the king said, "Enough," and had the slavery issue pushed to the front by the northern press, which so formed northern public opinion that they were willing to send their sons to die in the Civil War. The southern states were not fighting so much for the slave issue, but for the right to own property, any property. These property rights were granted by the king in the Treaty of 1783, knowing they would soon be forfeited by the American people through ignorance. Do you think you own your house? If you were to stop paying taxes, federal or state, you would soon find out that you were just being allowed to live and pay rent for this house, the rent being taxes to the king, who supplied the benefit of commerce. A free man, not under a monarch, democracy, dictatorship, or socialist government, but is under a republican form of government, would not and could not have his property taken. Why? The king's tax would not and could not be levied. If the Americans had been paying attention the first 70 years to the subterfuge and corruption of the Constitution and government representatives, instead of chasing the money supplied by the king, the conquest of this country during the Civil War could have been avoided. George Washington had vision during the Revolutionary War concerning the Civil War. You need to read it. See footnote 7. Civil War and the conquest that followed. The government and press propaganda that the war was to free the black people from slavery is ridiculous. Once you understand the Civil War 13th and 14th Amendments. The black people are just as much slaves today as before the Civil War, just as the white people are today. And also, we find ourselves subjects to the King and Queen of England. The only thing that changed for black people is they changed masters and were granted a few rights, which I might add can be taken away any time the government chooses. Since the 1930s, the black people have been paid reparations to buy off their silence. In other words, keep the slaves on the plantation working. I do not say this to shock or come across as prejudiced, because I'm not. Here's what Russell Means said. For those that don't remember who he is, he was the father in the movie The Last of the Mohicans. Russell Means said, quote, Until the white man is free, we will never be free, unquote. The we he was referring to were the Indians. There has never been a truer statement. However, the problem is the white people are not aware of their enslavement. At the risk of being redundant, to set the record straight, because Lord only knows what will be said about what I just said regarding black people, I believe that if you are born in this country, you are equal, period. Forget the empty promises of civil rights. What about your unalienable natural rights under God Almighty? All Americans are feudal tenants on the land, allowed to rent the property they live on as long as the king gets his cut. What about self-determination, or being able to own a allodial title to property, which means the king cannot take your property for failure to pay a tax, which means you did not own it to begin with. The king allows you to use the material goods and land. Again, this is financial servitude. The ultimate ownership of all property is in the state. Individual so-called quote-unquote ownership is only by virtue of government, i.e. law, amounting to a mere user, and use must be in accordance with law and subordinate to the necessities of the state. That came from Senate document number 43, written in 1933. The king controlled the government by the time the North won the Civil War through the use of lawyers that called the shots behind the scenes, just as they do now, and well-placed subjects in the United States government. This would not have been possible if not for England destroying our documents in 1812 and the covering up of state documents of the original 13th Amendment. According to international law, what took place when the North conquered the South? First, you have to understand the word conquest in international law. When you conquer a state, you acquire the land, and those that were subject to the conquered state then become subject to the conquerors. The laws of the conquered state remain in force until the conquering state wishes to change all or part of them. At the time of conquest, the laws of the conquered state are subject to change or removal, which means the law no longer lies with the American people through the Constitution, but lies with the new sovereign. The Constitution no longer carries any power of its own, but derives its power from the new sovereign, the conqueror. The reason for this is the Constitution derived its power from the people, and when they were defeated, so was the Constitution. Montgomery's a little confusing there. Derived its power from the people. Anyway. Seems to contradict what he'd written earlier about the Constitution. I think he clears it up later. He probably means privileges for the people. The following is the definition of conquest. Quote, the acquisition of the sovereignty of a country by force of arms, exercised by an independent power which reduces the vanquished to submission to its empire. The intention of the conqueror to retain the conquered territory is generally manifested by formal proclamation of annexation, and when this is combined with a recognized ability to retain the conquered territory, the transfer of sovereignty is complete. A treaty of peace based upon the principle of uti possidetis is formal recognition of conquest. The effects of conquest are to confer upon the conquering state the public property of the conquered state, and to invest the former with the rights and obligations of the latter. Treaties entered into by the conquered state with other states remain binding upon the annexing state, and the debts of the extinct state must be taken over by it. Conquest likewise invests the conquering state with sovereignty over the subjects of the conquered state. Among subjects of the conquered state are to be included persons domiciled in the conquered territory who remain there after the annexation. The people of the conquered state change their allegiance, but not their relations to one another, unquote. This from Lietensdorfer versus Webb. Doesn't say the year. Quote, after the transfer of political jurisdiction to the conqueror, the municipal laws of the territory continue in force until abrogated by the new sovereign. That from Bouvier's Law Dictionary under Conquest International Law. So what happened after the Civil War? Did not U.S. troops force the southern states to accept the 14th Amendment? The laws of America, the Constitution, were changed by the conquering government. Why? The main part I want you to see, as I said at the beginning of this paper, is watch the money and the commerce. The 14th Amendment says the government debt cannot be questioned. Why? Because now the king wants all the gold, silver, and copper, and the land, which can easily be done by increasing the government debt and making the American people sureties for the debt. This has been done by the sleight of hand of lawyers and the bankers. The conquering state is known as a belligerent. Read the following quotes. Belligerency is in international law. This is from Bouvier's dictionary. The status, quote, the status of de facto statehood attributed to a body of insurgents by which their hostilities are legalized. Before they can be recognized as belligerents, they must have some sort of political organization and be carrying on what in international law is regarded as legal war. There must be an armed struggle between two political bodies, each of which exercises de facto authority over persons within a determined territory and commands an army which is prepared to observe the ordinary laws of war. It is not enough that the insurgents have an army. They must have an organized civil authority directing the army. The exact point at which revolt or insurrection becomes belligerency is often extremely difficult to determine, and belligerents are not usually recognized by nations unless they have some strong reason or necessity for doing so. Either because the territory where the belligerency is supposed to exist is contiguous to their own, or because the conflict is in some way affecting their commerce or the rights of their citizens. One of the most serious results of recognizing belligerency is that it frees the parent country from all responsibility for what takes place within the insurgent lines. That, unquote, that from Bouvier's Law Dictionary. Again from Bouvier's Law Dictionary, belligerent in international law, as adjective and noun. Engaged in lawful war, a state so engaged. In plural, a body of insurgents who by reason of their temporary organized government are regarded as conducting lawful hostilities. Also, militia, corps of volunteers, and others, who, although not part of the regular army of the state, are regarded as lawful combatants provided they observe the laws of war, unquote. According to the international law, no law has been broken. Read the following about military occupation. Notice the third paragraph. After the Civil War, title to the land had not been completed to the conquerors, but after 1933 it was. I will address this in a moment. In the last paragraph it says, the commander-in-chief governs the conquered state. The proof that this is the case today is the U.S. flying the United States flag with a yellow fringe on 3 sides. According to the U.S. Code, Title 4, Section 1, the United States flag does not have a fringe on it. The difference being, one is a constitutional flag, and the fringed flag is a military flag. The military flag means you are in a military occupation and are governed by the commander-in-chief in his executive capacity, not under any constitutional authority. Read the following. Military occupation from Bouvier's Law Dictionary. Quote, this at most gives the invader certain partial and limited rights of sovereignty. Military occupation. Until conquest, the sovereign rights of the original owner remain intact. Conquest gives the conqueror full rights of sovereignty and retroactively legalizes all acts done by him during military occupation. Its only essential is actual and exclusive possession, which must be effective. A conqueror may exercise governmental authority, but only when in actual possession of the enemy's country, and this will be exercised upon principles of international law. See McLeod versus U.S. The occupant administers the government and may, strictly speaking, change the municipal law, but it is considered the duty of the occupant to make as few changes in the ordinary administration of the laws as possible, though he may proclaim martial law if necessary. He may occupy public land and buildings. He cannot alienate them so as to pass a good title, but a subsequent conquest would probably complete the title. Private lands and houses are usually exempt. Private movable property is exempt, though subject to contributions and requisitions. The former are payments of money to be levied only by the commander-in-chief. Military necessity may require the destruction of private property, and hostile acts of communities or individuals may be punished in the same way. Property may be liable to seizure as booty on the field of battle, or when a town refuses to capitulate and is carried by assault. When military occupation ceases, the state of things which existed previously is restored under the fiction of post-liminium. Territory acquired by war must necessarily be governed in the first instance by military power under the direction of the President as Commander-in-Chief. Civil government can only be put in operation by the action of the appropriate political department of the government at such time and in such degree as it may determine. It must take effect either by the action of the treaty-making power or by that of Congress. So long as Congress has not incorporated the territory into the United States, neither military occupation nor cession by treaty makes it domestic territory in the sense of the revenue laws. Congress may establish a temporary government which is not subject to all the restrictions of the Constitution. See Downs versus Bidwell. That's unquote. That all about military occupation from Bouvier's Law Dictionary. Paragraph 1 through 3 of the definition of military occupation describes what took place during and after the Civil War. What took place during the Civil War and post-Civil War has been legal under international law. You should notice in paragraph 3 that at the end of the Civil War, title to the land was not complete, but the subsequent conquest completed the title. What was the next conquest? That would be 1933, when the American people were alienated by our being declared enemies of the conqueror, and by their declaring war against all Americans. Read the following quotes and also see footnote 8. The following are excerpts from the Senate Report, 93rd Congress, November 19, 1973, Special Committee on the Termination of the National Emergency, United States Senate. Since March 9, 1933, the United States has been in a state of declared national emergency. Under the powers delegated by these statutes, the President may seize property, organize and control the means of production, seize commodities, assign military forces abroad, institute martial law, seize and control all transportation and communication, regulate the operation of private enterprise, restrict travel, and in a plethora of particular ways, control the lives of all American citizens. A majority of the people of the United States have lived all their lives under emergency rule. For 40 years, freedoms and governmental procedures guaranteed by the Constitution have, in varying degrees, been abridged by laws brought into force by states of national emergency. From at least the Civil War, in important ways shaped the present phenomenon of a permanent state of national emergency. In Title 12, in Section 95B, you'll find the following codification of the emergency war powers. The actions, regulations, rules, licenses, orders, and proclamations heretofore or hereafter taken, promulgated, made, or issued by the President of the United States or the Secretary of the Treasury since March 4, 1933, pursuant to the authority conferred by subsection B of Section 5 of the Act of October 6, 1917, as amended in 12 U.S.C.S. 95A, are hereby approved and confirmed. March 9, 1933, C1, Title 1, 148, Statute 1. It is clear that the bankrupt de facto government of the United States, which is operating under the War Powers Act and executive orders, not the Constitution for the United States, has in effect issued under its Admiralty law letters of marque or piracy to its private agencies, the IRS, ATF, FBI, and DEA, with further enforcement by its officers in the courts, local police, and sheriffs. They've waged war against the American people and have classed Americans as enemy aliens. The following definition is from Bouvier's Law Dictionary, 1934, of letters marque. It says, quote, a commission granted by the government to a private individual to take the property of a foreign state or of the citizens or subjects of such state as a reparation for an injury committed by such state, its citizens or subjects. The prizes so captured are divided between the owners of the privateer the captain and the crew. A vessel to a friendly port, but armed for its own defense in case of attack by an enemy, is also called a letter of marque. Words and phrases, dictionary. The following is from Grinnin versus Edwards. By the law of nations, an enemy is defined to be, quote, one with whom a nation's at open war, unquote. When the sovereign ruler of a state declares war against another sovereign, it is understood the whole nation declares war against that other nation. All the subjects of one are enemies to all the subjects of the other, and during the existence of the war, they continue enemies in whatever country they may happen to be. Quote, and all persons residing within the territory occupied by the belligerents, although they are in fact foreigners, are liable to be treated as enemies, unquote. So we find ourselves enemies in our own country and subjects of a king that has conquered our land with heavy taxation and no possibility of fair representation. The government has, through the laws of forfeiture, taken prize and booty for the king, under the admiralty and executive powers as declared by the law of the flag, none of which could have been done with the built-in protection contained in the true and original 13th Amendment, which has been kept, and memory hold, from the American people. The fraudulent amendments and legislation that followed the Civil War bankrupted the American people and put the privateers, i.e. the banksters, in power, and enforced by the promise of prize and booties to their partners in crime, i.e. the government. The following is the definition of a tyrant. Webster's New Universal Unabridged Dictionary defines tyrant as follows, quote, 1. An absolute ruler, one who seized sovereignty illegally, a usurper. 2. A cruel, oppressive ruler, a despot. 3. One who exercises his authority in an oppressive manner, a cruel master, unquote. The following quote is from Alexis de Tocqueville from Volume 1 of Democracy in America. Quote, when I see that the right and means of absolute command are conferred on a people or upon a king, upon an aristocracy or a democracy, a monarchy or republic, I recognize the germ of tyranny, and I journey onwards to a land of more helpful institutions, unquote. So we pick up with paragraph 4, which describes the taxation under military occupation, and that you are under executive control and are bound under admiralty law by the contracts we enter, including silent contracts and by military occupation. Notice the last sentence in paragraph 5. Congress may establish a temporary government which is not subject to all the restrictions of the Constitution. See also Harvard Law Review, The Insular Cases. This means, folks, that you do not have a constitutional government. You have a military dictatorship controlled by the president as commander-in-chief. What is another way you can check out what I am telling you? Oh, read the following quotes. Quote, the United States may acquire territory by conquest or by treaty, and may govern it through the exercise of the power of Congress conferred by Section 3 of Article 4 of the Constitution. In exercising this power, Congress is not subject to the same constitutional limitations as when it is legislating for the United States. And in general, the guarantees of the Constitution, save as they are limitations upon the exercise of executive and legislative power, when exerted for or over our insular possessions, extend to them only as Congress, in the exercise of its legislative power over territory belonging to the United States, has made those guarantees applicable, unquote. That from Hooven and Allison and Company versus Evatt, 1945. Quote, the idea prevails with some indeed. It found expression in arguments at the bar that we have in this country substantially or practically two national governments. One to be maintained under the Constitution with all its restrictions, the other to be maintained by Congress outside and independently of that instrument, by exercising such powers as other nations of the earth are accustomed to exercise. I take leave to say that if the principles thus announced should ever receive the sanction of a majority of this court, a radical and mischievous change in our system of government will be the result. We will, in that event, pass from the era of constitutional liberty, guarded and protected by a written constitution, into an era of legislative absolutism. It will be an evil day for American liberty if the theory of a government outside of the supreme law of the land finds lodgment in our constitutional jurisprudence. No higher duty rests upon this court than to exert its full authority to prevent all violation of the principles of the Constitution, unquote. That quote from Downs versus Bidwell, 1901. Okay, folks, this has been part 2 of The United States is Still a British Colony by James Montgomery. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been The Ministry of Truth. Of common men. And the fourth definition, the persons collectively who enjoy rank above commoners, i.e. the peerage, unquote. The aforementioned sections in the Constitution for the United States and the above proposed 13th Amendment sought to prohibit the above definition, which would give any advantage or privilege to some citizens an unequal opportunity to achieve or exercise political power. 13 of the 17 states listed below understood the importance of this amendment. The following states voted for the amendment between the years 1810 and 1819. How is that possible? Well, anyway, Maryland, Kentucky, Ohio, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Vermont, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept any of the present emolument, office, or title, or of any kind whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state, unquote. Also, Section 10, Clause 1 states, quote, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque or reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto of law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility, unquote. There was, however, no measurable penalty for violating. This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Time for part 2 of The United States is still a British colony, by James Montgomery. The Forgotten Amendment. The Articles of Confederation, Article 6 states, quote, "Nor shall the United States in Congress assembled," and United is not capitalized, by the way, "or any of them grant any title of nobility," unquote. The Constitution for the United States, United not capitalized, in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 states, quote, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States," United not capitalized, "and no person holding any office or profit or trust under them or honor, or shall, without the consent of Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, office, or emolument of any kind whatever from any emperor, king, prince, or foreign power. Such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them or either of them," unquote. From An American Dictionary of the English Language, first edition, by Noah Webster, 1828, the definition of nobility is, the third definition, the quality, quote, "the qualities which constitute distinction of rank in civil society, according to the customs or laws of the country, that eminence or dignity which a man derives from birth or title conferred, and which places him in an order above of the above sections." Congress saw this as a great threat to the freedom of Americans and our republican form of government. In January 1810, Senator Reed proposed the original 13th Amendment. And it has nothing to do with the 13th Amendment you know of today. The original 13th Amendment, and on April 26, 1810, was passed by the Senate 26-1, and by the House 87-3 on May 1st, 1810, and submitted to the 17 states for ratification. The amendment read as follows, quote, "If any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive, or retain any title of nobility